When looking at the New York Mets roster right now, it is clear that they have a problem, and that is their J.D. Davis, Dominic Smith problem. Two players that don't quite fit this roster. What should the Mets do with them moving forward? I'm going to talk about that on today's episode of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans who are listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Locked On Mets is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Now, on today's show, we're going to talk about an age-old problem for the New York Mets. Been dealing with it for years here. What do they do with J.D. Davis and Dominic Smith, two players that just don't quite fit this roster? In the first segment, I'm going to talk about the roster crunch, how the Mets might need to lose one of these guys or trade one of these guys to be able to add and really optimize the group they're going to go into opening day with. In the second segment, I'll talk about the trade value each of these players has. Which one would get the Mets more on the market? What could you expect in return for either of these players? I'll dive into that a bit. Then finally, in the last segment, going to talk about which player fits the Mets more in 2022 and which one they should ultimately deal. Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing about the Mets at justbaseball.com. So, talking about J.D. Davis and Dominic Smith, these are players with very similar career arcs. With J.D., obviously a top prospect in Houston, started out there before getting traded to the Mets. Dominic Smith, a homegrown top prospect. They did not meet expectations in the first couple of years of their respective careers. 2019 rolls around, and suddenly they have breakout performances. For Dominic Smith, it was in the first half before he hurt his foot and missed most of the second half of the season, returning in that final game of the year and hitting a walk-off homer against the Braves. J.D. Davis, once Dom went down, slid into that starting role in left field and had a really nice offensive season. 2020 rolls around. Dominic Smith was great that year. So good, in fact, that I actually questioned whether he was a better long-term fit at first base than Pete Alonso. I actually had the discussion on this show, and I wasn't sure at the time because I took way too much stock in the 2020 season where this guy was just on another level offensively. And I thought, is his floor higher than Pete's? I know defensively, the floor should be higher with Dominic Smith and Pete Alonso. So does that make the complete player, a safer proposition for Dominic Smith and Pete Alonso? Then we watch a full season play out this year, and Dom puts up really bad offensive numbers, and Pete Alonso shows that, yes, every single year he's going to be that consistent source of power. And obviously that discussion has been put to bed for good at this point. That's Pete's job. Dominic Smith is just trying to fit in here, but that leads you to more issues. What do you do with Dominic Smith if he can't play first base? Does he have to keep being a left fielder? Do you still want to keep that experiment going when you know that overall he's not a good defensive outfielder? It's just really tough. And for his career, it's almost better for him to go somewhere else. And that's another similarity these two guys have, because I think J.D. Davis is in the same boat. He needs to go to a team where he can play first base or where he can DH and get 600 plate appearances and really establish himself a little bit more. Both of these guys are caught in the middle where they're too good to cut, but they're not necessarily good enough to start, or at least go into a season expecting them to start. And I think either of them on the right bench is a great player to have, where if Eduardo Escobar goes on the IL, J.D. Davis can fill in for 2 weeks and the lineup won't miss a beat. But defensively, what are you losing there? And are you sure he's going to be consistent? And is J.D. going to hit home runs? Because he hasn't been hitting home runs the last 2 years. Dominic Smith, you just can't count on that bat being consistent. And as I already mentioned, there's the defensive concerns. So with these players, in a vacuum, they're good. But for the Mets, I almost don't know if either of them fits this team moving forward. And then you look at the current roster. And I was talking about this on Friday's show where I was going through Mark Vientos and how I wanted him on the Mets in 2022, or I want him on the Mets this next season because I think he can have an unbelievable impact with that home run hitting bat of his. But how do you fit him onto the roster? The problem right now, you're looking at the Mets roster. At the moment, you need Louis Guillorme because who else is going to back up Lindor at shortstop? You got no other options here. So if Guillorme's got a spot, if Tomas Nido has a spot, where does that leave you the rest of your bench? Because Robinson Cano, are they going to cut him? I don't think so. I still think that they're looking at him as a bat that can bring them a little bit of value. You're already sunk on $20+ million the next 2 years, but maybe he can be a DH for you. And honestly, Cano almost gives you more coverage than either of these players defensively because you can throw Cano at second base, at third base, and at first base. And I actually think defensively, he's probably better at all of those positions than either of these guys. I think that even though Robinson Cano is going to be 39 years old or just turned 39 years old in October, even with that, he's got soft hands and he's got high baseball IQ. And that's more than I can say about J.D. Davis in particular in the infield. And with Dominic Smith, he doesn't get the opportunity to play in the infield because of Pete Alonso. So if you're just talking about roster construction, if the Mets were to trade JD and Dom, well, now your bench would have Robinson Cano as the bat first backup infield option and Louis Guillorme as the glove first backup infield option. And then you'd have more room to get a complete fourth outfielder. But right now, because of how the roster has to be constructed with all these guys being major league players, your bench is going to be it's not flexible and it just doesn't function quite the way you would like it to, where now Dominic Smith is the fourth outfielder for a team because you just don't have room for a traditional fourth outfielder that can actually play center field and all over the place out there and can give you some quality defense. So the Mets are in a really weird spot with their roster right now, particularly with that bench as they're trying to figure things out. And because of that, you are in a position where if you want to make the big splash everyone's dreaming about and sign Chris Bryant, which I think I've talked about enough, some of the reasons why that would concern me, but I'm not going to do that on this show. You can find the past episode where I talked about Chris Bryant or Jose Ramirez, where I dived into it and some of the defensive liabilities that Bryant's going to bring to the table as well, regardless of whether it's Bryant, whether it's reuniting with Jonathan VR, whether it's trading for another player, however you want to add to this team. If you want to get another bat in here, you're going to have to give up at least one of these guys, if not both of them, to make the roster make sense. And that's what I was trying to get at on Friday's show when I first addressed this, talking about Mark Vientos. And that's what we're going to focus on a little bit more throughout the show today, because the Mets are in a really weird position if they keep all these guys on the roster heading into spring training. But in the next segment, what I want to talk about is the trade value that Dominic Smith and J.D. Davis have going into next season. All right, Mets fans, I'm going to give you the inside track on the absolute best fantasy baseball platform in the industry, and that is Fantrax. Fantrax is the most customizable fantasy experience you will find for your dynasty, keeper, redraft, and best ball leagues. You can create or join a fantasy baseball commissioner league, invite your friends, and dominate your draft this season. It's also the top dynasty fantasy baseball where you can go deep with the ultimate keeper leagues, create a simple redraft league, or even a customizable best ball league with up to 2,000 teams. If you're coming from another service, Fantrax can import any of your current leagues and customize if needed. Among the most trusted names in fantasy sports since 2008, Fantrax invites you to sign up today for free. And if you do, you'll be entered to win an official MLB signed Fernando Tatis Jr. baseball. Simply go to fantrax.com/lockedon. Use the promo code TATIS when you sign up, and you will be eligible to win. Again, that is fantrax.com/lockedon. Use that promo code TATIS to be entered for a chance to win an official signed baseball by Fernando Tatis Jr. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. Let's play ball. Does this sound familiar? You got one device that lets you catch the game live, another lets you stream your favorite shows. You're watching your sports highlights on your phone, and you've got your neighbor's best friend's login for the other good stuff you're missing. Well, I want to tell you about a simple way to get all that entertainment you love without the hassle, and a great way to finally get your TV together. It's called DirecTV Stream. brings your live TV and on-demand favorites together like never before, so you can watch your favorite sports, movies, and shows all in one place. That means no more juggling remotes, no need to buy another device ever again, and the best part, there's no annual contract. So get rid of the clutter and the confusion. Get your TV together with DirecTV Stream. You can learn more at directv.com. That's directv.com. Compatible device required. Content varies by package. All right, so which player has more trade value, J.D. Davis or Dominic Smith? Very tough question to answer because honestly, neither of them have the highest trade value right now. And for both of them, I'm not sure if they ever really will have outstanding trade value. Yes, you have these players for a couple of more years after this season. So there is that. They become free agents in 2025. So you have 2022, 2023, and 2024. 3 years of control is a good time to trade a player. You would think that other teams look at that player and they say, yeah, these are the arbitration years, but with players that haven't accomplished too much, you're talking about cost-controlled players that can help you win now that potentially could be long-term solutions for some of these teams because they might be amenable to a contract extension at some point if they have a good first year. These are players that another team's going to look at and say, well, maybe a change of scenery will spark something, right? Maybe that's all that these guys require. And particularly with Dominic Smith, I think you're really going to be talking yourself into a trade if you're another team, as opposed to looking at the numbers and being blown away. But you're going to take his situation and say, all right, well, he really started to figure things out in 2019. It's not hard to go back in time and figure out what happened there between 2018 and 2019. Dominic Smith lost a lot of weight. He got on a CPAP machine to deal with his sleep apnea. So he started to actually get good rest, and that resulted in better performance. So a team can look at Dominic Smith's career, see that Pete Alonso came up right when he started to figure it out, and think, okay, for our team, we can make Dominic Smith our starting first baseman and see what happens. And those are the teams you're going to be looking for, teams that have that vacancy, that are looking to just maybe manufacture an asset. Even if you're the Pittsburgh Pirates, do you take a flyer on Dominic Smith because, hey, if he has a great season, suddenly you have a trade asset? I mean, that is what could go into moving either of these guys, is finding the right situation where a team's going to look at the player and say, we want to gamble on a big bounce back performance by either of these guys. And I think that's where the value is, but that's not going to net you some great return. In a lot of respects, the Mets would be trading these guys to clear the roster spot and hoping they get something back that can either help their ball club in the short term or a piece that's a young prospect that's a lottery ticket. And who knows, maybe that player can turn into something. If you remember, the Mets traded Ike Davis. I can't remember the entire package if there was something else, but the main piece was Vic Black that they got back at the time. And Vic Black was a player that I'm thinking had at least a cup of coffee with the Pirates at the major league level, but really it was a reliever that had a big arm that you thought maybe he could slide into the back end of the Mets bullpen if everything broke right. It didn't ultimately, but that was the type of trade they made for an Ike Davis. With Dominic Smith, I think you're talking about something similar, trying to find a reliever for your bullpen next year. If you could get a quality reliever for either J.D. Davis or Dominic Smith that was even under control for a couple of years, almost similar to trading for Miguel Castro at the deadline in 2020, that type of an arm, I think you'd be pretty happy with that, particularly because you'd be clearing a spot that you're going to address on your roster. You're going to make another signing, make a different trade. You're going to do something else with that roster spot to improve your bench or to get a bona fide DH in here. A lot of different things the Mets could do once they clear those spots. But if they were able to do that and get some pitching back, then the Mets would be pretty happy. If you could get a Joey Lucchesi type, the deal they made last offseason where they're able to get a starting pitcher that had, what was it, 3 years of control? He has another year. Yeah, so I think 3 years of control in Lucchesi, who you're able, or maybe even 4. Let me actually look that up. Joey Lucchesi becomes a free agent. I mean, the Mets did hang on to Lucchesi when they could have non-tendered him this offseason because he has Tommy John or just had Tommy John. He'll be out next year, free agent in 2025. So, yeah, that is 2021, 22. So 4 years of control the Mets traded for when they got Lucchesi. If you can get a starting pitcher like that who hasn't quite performed, but hey, that's more depth. These are the type of trades the Mets have to be exploring right now with these players, and they can be talking trades right now. That's one thing that is really interesting about this CBA lockout is that these executives who aren't really going to be in the grind of negotiations for a CBA, like Billy Epler is going to have nothing to do with the negotiations with the MLB and the MLBPA. He's just right now building out a coaching staff. But as we get longer into this offseason process, when this lockout continues, they can call other GMs, they can have conversations and start to see what the market is for some of these players. And that's why I do think you could see a lot of trades when that new CBA gets enacted, where you could just see a bunch of deals just flurry through. And maybe JD Davis and Dominic Smith are among them. But when focusing back in on which player has more value, I think that it's almost the same. I don't know if either of them really has an edge or a clear edge. I think it depends on the team. Certain teams are going to value certain players a little more than the other. I think that a team can talk themselves into Dominic Smith being a fixture a lot easier than they can talk about, or they can talk themselves into JD Davis, because JD Davis, the defensive questions are so pronounced with him that I just don't know how many teams are going to look at that as a piece they can bring in that will be the answer at third base, whereas I could see a team thinking, well, maybe Dominic Smith can be our first baseman of the future. That's still on the table. But also, when it comes to trade value, JD Davis for a contending team, in my opinion, far more valuable. I mean, if you're talking about a team that is maybe trying to add a bat that can DH, get 400 plate appearances for them, maybe play a little bit of third base, but more just DH and mash left-handed pitching. JD Davis does have a lot of value in that sense. So if there's a team out there that's looking for that type of a bat and has an arm that they're willing to throw back the other way, or has a prospect, an 18-year-old prospect that the Mets really love, an international free agent that was just signed by another team that they were in on, or something like that, you could see that type of a trade come together, and it would make a lot of sense. So I think it just depends on each specific team when it comes to the value these guys have. But overall, what we're talking about here when it comes to trade value, don't expect a blue chip prospect coming back to the Mets for either of these guys. Don't expect to get a bona fide, no doubt about it, starting pitcher to slot into your rotation, or some lockdown reliever that's just awesome for either of these guys. But what you're going to try to do is find some value. And this is where the Mets' new analytical department, as they keep on adding to it and they're getting more information every day, it is their job to find the players around the league, the other depressed assets that you can find out there, and try to make a trade work. And I think that's going to be the perfect trade for the Mets here. If you can find another team's high octane reliever that hasn't quite worked, but you think you can tweak one or two things in their delivery to make them better, or you can maybe find that starting pitcher that hasn't quite found success but has a really great slider that they aren't throwing enough, and maybe if they use that pitch more, they can actually be effective. It's about finding another depressed asset that makes more sense for your current roster and making that swap where both teams can try something new. I think that is where you're going with either of these guys. But again, ultimately, this is not the time where you're trading these guys to maximize their value. You're trying to maximize your roster. And that's the discussion we're going to continue in just a minute, because I want to talk about which player fits the 2022 Mets more. Is it JD or is it Dominic Smith? Founded in 2009, Stance Apparel represents a radical reinvention of socks, underwear, and active apparel with a sharp focus on comfort, quality, and creativity. Stance brings an atypical aesthetic alongside some of pop culture's hottest collaborations, creating the ultimate in-style form of self-expression, because everything you wear should be a direct extension of who you are and how you feel. I just received some Stance Apparel in the mail, and I was just blown away by how comfortable everything is. Super soft. The designs are really unique, whether you're interested in Batman, Star Wars, The Office, Major League Baseball, the NBA. There's so many different things you can choose from when you go to Stance. And the one thing, again, is the comfort level. No matter what you get, it's going to be comfortable. I also was just looking at the site and I found my favorite Christmas movie of all time, Elf, was on there. So I just bought a pair of socks for myself as well. Stance offers color, comfort, and creativity. like no other. And what's really great about Stance is they believe that the perfect fit matters more than fitting in, that those who feel good do good. Go see it for yourself. Register for an account at stance.com and get 15% off your first purchase by using the promo code locked on at checkout. Enjoy the color and comfort of a life less ordinary with Stance. All right, so which player fits the New York Mets roster more in 2022? Is it Dominic Smith or is it J.D. Davis? Now, if you listen to my show on Friday talking about Mark Vientos, and if you've been listening to the show for the past couple of years, you know my opinions on J.D. Davis. The defense has always concerned me, and I've always mentioned how his playing time has gotten in the way of some other players flourishing. And now that you have Vientos waiting in the wings, two players that are very similar with the defensive concerns, being right-handed power bats, it makes a lot of sense to me to move JD Davis so that Mark Vientos can flourish. But let's not talk about Mark Vientos and a player that's not on the major league roster yet. Let's just talk about who fits this current roster more. If you get into that conversation, then I wonder if JD Davis becomes the answer, that he fits the team more, because the bench currently has Robinson Cano on it, has Louis Guillorme on it. That's two left-handed hitters. Dominic Smith and Robinson Cano, in a weird way, even though they don't play the same position, fill a very similar role on a Mets bench next year. They're that left-handed bat you could go to as a DH or a pinch hitter. And defensively, they can both back up Pete Alonso at first base as well. So you look at that aspect of it, and that makes Dominic Smith seem like a piece that maybe doesn't quite fit. The one thing I will say is that if the Mets want to really maximize their team next year, the answer might be to trade both of these guys. I mean, that might be where we're really talking. And it's not that they can't fit, it's that are they the best fits? Because unless the Mets do something else when it comes to their backup shortstop, and trust me, I'm not saying they shouldn't have Louis Guillorme be the backup shortstop. I'm a big Guillorme stan over here. Okay, I'm a fan. Louis Guillorme is a player that I want to see get more at-bats, get more playing time. I love watching him play defense. I'm all in on Guillorme. I have been for the last couple of years, so that's not what I'm saying. But when he's on your roster, you need that extra pop on the bench. And I'm not positive that either of these guys are going to give you that home run pop off the bench. Particularly J.D. Davis, who's been hitting the ball on the ground a lot the last couple of years, or at least hitting line drives, but not getting enough lift to carry those balls out of the yard. I don't know if he's the perfect fit for this team. And Dominic Smith has just been really inconsistent. And so when you talk about those things, is it better if the Mets were to clear both of these guys out and even bring back a Jonathan VR? Is Jonathan VR a better fit for this team? It's tough. I don't know. Does he bring a little more pop than these guys? He certainly had more home runs this past year. It's just a really interesting dynamic the Mets have right now, because, again, these guys are too good to cut, but their trade value is murky, to say the least. And their fit on this team is just, it's not a good one. So the Mets are in a really weird spot here, but I think ultimately the piece that I still believe should be moved more than any other is JD Davis, because of the presence of Mark Vientos. Because Mark Vientos in 2022 should be big league ready. That bat was already close this past year. And I just think because of that, this might be the time to move JD. Also, his offensive season was good enough that I think there are other teams that would at least trade for him. And even if you're not getting max return, you can at least find somebody that would be like, all right, I'll take that bat in my lineup. And I don't think the Mets would miss him that much. Dominic Smith is an interesting fit on this roster because at least he does play the outfield. I think the J.D. Davis experiment out there is over. And so the one thing Billy Epler has said is he likes guys that can play on the grass and in the dirt. And because of that, Dominic Smith does have a little bit more value to this Mets team in that he could be your backup first baseman if Pete Alonso went out, or if one of your starting 3 outfielders go out, because all of them can play center field, you could slide Dominic Smith back into left field and get by for a month if that ultimately happens throughout a season, which inevitably it will. I think that's what we're looking at right now with these guys. They're just good dudes. They've been fan favorites, but if the Mets want to take their team to another level, if they want to make another big move, it's going to require some subtractions, and these are the guys that are most likely to be dealt. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On Bets, hosted by your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling. Get daily picks, blowout specials, wrong team favorite picks, and Lee Sterling's lock of the day by following Locked On Bets wherever you get podcasts.